Hi all, thanks for joining me on part 2 of this Jam Labs Office 365 tutorial. Just a recap from part 1. So we did an introduction of my on-premise environment. We tried to send an email, which unfortunately didn't get through because my ISP assigns me a dynamic IP address and most SMTP servers block that. So what we're going to be doing in this part is setting up an Azure site-to-site VPN, linking my Azure tenant to my on-premise environment, and then hosting an Exchange Edge server in Azure to use as our ingress and egress point for messages coming into and leaving jablab.co.uk. Before we start getting into the actual configuration of the Azure tenant, I thought it would be useful if we just have a quick look at the theory behind what we need to set up and how it's going to be set up to enable a site-to-site VPN between my on-premise and my Azure tenant. So jumping straight onto my on-premise environment, I've got a Windows 7 workstation we saw in part 1. It's running Hyper-V and it's attached to a Virgin Media broadband router, pretty much like any home setup. I've got a dynamic IP address on the router, but in fact it actually doesn't change, but for the purposes of what we're doing, it might as well change, it doesn't really matter. So jumping over to the Azure tenant, one of the first things we need to do on the Azure tenant is create a subnet. I've gone for my favorite address range, which is 10.10.0.0. You can use absolutely any address range that suits your needs. It doesn't have to be 10.10.0.0. Importantly, within that Azure network, there's two subnets we need to create. The first subnet is going to be used to host my Exchange Edge server, and the second subnet has to have a name of gateway, and it's going to be hosting the external gateway device. This gateway device also needs an external IP address, which we'll be setting up, and it's the endpoint for the VPN tunnel when communicating with my on-premise environment. Jumping back to my on-premise environment, we'll need to install a Windows 2012 RAS server. Now this RAS server is going to be where the actual VPN is terminated and where the routing occurs. And obviously we've got our Exchange servers already on premise. The on-premise network is a 192.168.0 network. So we can route between that and the 10 networks up in the cloud using the Windows 2012 RAS server. The Exchange Edge server will sit in subnet 1, as we discussed before, in the cloud. And we'll be giving that an external IP address. Now that external IP address is quite key because that's where the MX records will be pointing to. So in theory, what should happen is a mail via the MX record should come to my Edge server. My Edge server will determine it needs to get to a 192 address. It'll go over the VPN gateway device, across the site-to-site VPN onto my router. My router will then forward that onto the RAS server. The RAS server will terminate the VPN and send the packets on to my Exchange server, allowing, in theory, messages to be delivered to and from the internet with a static IP address without the issues we had in part 1, where ISPs were rejecting my mail because it came from a dynamic IP address. So let's start the configuration of the Azure tenant to set up the site-to-site VPN. I'm going to start off by logging on to my tenant. Let's get that done. Just give it a few seconds to load up all the tabs. At the moment I've got a free trial, but obviously I'll convert that to a pay-as-you-go once my free trial runs out to preserve what I've done. the tenant itself doesn't actually have any services configured. It's pretty much a brand new tenant which I've set up. So there's no resources, no resource groups. So let's start off first of all by creating a resource group. And a resource group is basically a holder that will hold all the resources for easier management. And it's a different way of doing it than the classic portal that some of you may have been used to. And that's pretty much the resource group created. Again, it's empty, there's nothing in there at the time being, so just jumping into it, there's no resources in this resource group. So let's start off by adding a resource in that resource group. And earlier on, one of the first things I said we were going to do was create a network resource. So let's add that in. So it's a virtual network we want to create. Just going down the list is second. So let's just select that. Deployment model. There's two, there's classic and resource manager. Resource manager is the newer one and it kind of fits my needs. So I'm going to go with latest tech and create a virtual network within the resource manager. Let's give it a name. Again, you can call it anything you want. I'm probably going to go for a nice simple name like VNet1. Address space, I'm going to change the default to 10.10.0.0 and leave the subnet mask as 16. That gives me 65,000 addresses. So the first subnet I'm going to create in there is subnet 1, which is what's going to be hosting my Azure VPN for my VPN virtual machine for my edge server. And I'm going to limit that to 256 addresses. Again, it's free trial. Resource group. We've got an existing resource group we just created a few seconds ago, so I'm going to select that. Location, I'm going to stick to Western Europe and I'm going to take it off the dashboard. And let's create that. This shouldn't take too long. Let's just give it a few more seconds. And a few more seconds. Let's just jump back and have a look if it's created yet. Yep, there it is. So we've got a first network on the 10.10.0.0 address range defined in our resource group. Obviously there's no connected devices just now, and the subnet we created was subnet 1 to host our VMs, giving us 251 addresses within there. The next thing we need to do is create the gateway subnet, which is going to host our gateway device. I'm just going to change that to 10.10.254 and limit the subnet mask to 29. That'll give us 8 addresses, which is more than enough for our needs. Network security group, that's basically a firewall rules. I've got nothing defined in the routing table. I've got nothing defined right now. So let's add that in, and that will complete the subnets that we need. So it's an initial network with 2 subnets called subnet 1 and gateway subnet. And that's done. Fantastic. So let's close some of these tabs and pop back to the next thing we need to do. Okay, so now let's add a virtual network gateway. do a search on that. Okay, it'll help if I actually knew how to spell network, so let's just change that. Virtual network gateway, and it should hopefully list there first in the list. Interestingly, the local network gateway will be creating as well, but let's start with the virtual network gateway. So let's give it a name. I'm not going to use very imaginative names. I'm going to just stick to the basics. So it's going to be called Virtual Network 1-Gateway. Define what network this gateway is going to sit in, and it's the virtual network that we created. Again, as discussed earlier, it's going to need a public IP address, and it's going to need a name for that public IP address. So I'll probably just stick an IP on the end of that name, just so I know what it is when I look in Resource Manager, and click OK. Next is asking us the gateway type. We want VPN. Interestingly, there you can see express route. So this is a similar method when setting up an express route to your on-premise environment. VPN type route-based or policy-based. Because I'm using RAS server, I need to use route-based. Resource group. We've got a resource group called Resource Group 1. Location, Western Europe. I'm not going to put this on the dashboard, and let's click Create on that. Okay, this does take a few seconds longer than actually creating the subnets. I suspect somewhere in the background there is a VM firing up, running the gateway device. So it can take sometimes a few minutes, sometimes less, and in this case it didn't take that long. So let's have a look what we've got. We've got our gateway IP address, we've got our gateway, and we've got our network. The IP address we've been given is 40 hidden away, which is good. So that's going to be our permanent external IP address. It's key because when we set up the RAS server and set up the VPN, that's the IP address we're going to be referencing as the endpoint in Azure. Okay, the next thing we need to do is create a local network gateway, and this basically defines the IP address of my router and the network address ranges that are on premise. So first of all, as per the other objects, we need to give it a name. Okay, the IP address we place here is the IP address of your on-premise router. Now, I'm lucky enough to have a dynamic IP address that never actually changes. If you have a dynamic IP address that does actually change, then the entry here would need to be modified every time your IP address changed. The address space is the 192.168.0.0 that I use on my internal network on-premise. And if you had additional networks, you can just simply add them in here with their subnet mask range. Resource group again, I'll stick to resource group 1 just to containerize everything together, and I'll take it off the dashboard. I don't like a cluttered dashboard. And it's setting up the local network gateway. So far we've got an Azure network, 2 subnets, a gateway device, and a local network gateway. So those are the building blocks for the site-to-site VPN. Once that's done, the next thing we'll need to create is actually a connection object. Okay, it takes a little while for them to appear as resources. You could refresh away, but I'm sure they'll turn up. There you go, on-prem network 1. and it's got the IP address of my route and the address space that we specified before. Okay, so let's just add the connection object. Just giving it a name of v1 on-prem connection or con. Just choosing the gateway, and the local gateway is on-prem network 1. Pre-shared key is again configuration that I'm going to need to use to create the connection on my RAS server. So whatever you add in here, just make a note of it. Resource group 1, again locations locked. And let's click OK to start the creation of that. So now we've got a connection object, a local gateway, a gateway device in Azure, 2 subnets, and a single virtual network. And that's pretty much all the configuration that we need to do on the Azure side of things. In the next part, I'll be installing RAS and configuring the on-premise side of this and actually switching on the site-to-site VPN and connecting it. But before I do that, I'm just going to wait for the connection object to be created. Yep, and it's there. Okay, it's saying not connected, obviously, because I haven't configured the on-premise side of it. It gives you the data in and the data out. And it gives you the virtual network gateway address and the local network gateway address as the 2 endpoints for the virtual network. I'm just going to pin that to the dashboard. So every time I log in onto the dashboard, I can see the connection status. Tidy up, close up some of these tabs and get back to the dashboard. And yeah, there you go. Connection objects there. Obviously still not connected, but in the next part we'll change that. And that's it. Azure's ready to go. Join me on the next part where I start configuring the on-premise environment and actually set up the connection. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.